looked at the role of lexical fixedness in the processing of word combinations in L1 and L2. Let me just minimize my, okay. I'll just minimize all of you, otherwise I can't see my slides. And when there are questions, then I will get you back so I can see who's talking to me. So the approach that kind of underpins this entire study and kind of what motivated us is what we call the phraseological approach. It's an approach pioneered by Cowie, by Haworth, and a few others, kind of in the early days of research into collocations, research into multi-word expressions. So you can see the references are somewhat old, but that's because these are sort of the pioneers of this phraseological approach. So the phraseological approach distinguishes word combinations in terms of two major things. The first one is lexical fixedness. You can think of it as, for example, can you substitute a word within a phrase? Can you easily substitute a word within a formulaic phrase or multi-word expression? And the second dimension that's key to the phraseological models is compositionality. In other words, do individual components help you understand the meaning of the entire phrase? So the two dimensions, the two characteristics, the two features, lexical fixedness and compositionality, are kind of related, but it's important to know that they're distinct. And the way I understand them is what I have here in the parentheses. So lexical fixedness is whether or not you can substitute one of the elements in a collocation and preserve its meaning or preserve its naturalness. And compositionality is whether the individual components help you understand the meaning of the phrase. So something along the lines of, let me have a think, let's think of a two-word phrase. For example, Red Cross, right? It can be figurative, it can be literal, but it's fairly compositional, right? Because the individual meaning of the constituents helps you understand the meaning of the entire phrase. But something like kick the bucket, meaning to die, is non point made by the proponents of the phraseological approach. So it's a continuum, right? And many things in applied linguistics many things pertinent to researching multi-word expressions are best viewed on a continuum. So for example, frequency, literality or figurativeness, compositionality, lexical fixedness, transparency. All these things are not yes or no, black and white. It's not a dichotomy, but these things are best viewed on a continuum, more or less, right? So we're looking at the phraseological continuum where we have free combinations at the far left. Free combinations. Let me see if I can get my, oops, my pointer. Where's the pointer? Okay, so here we have at the far left, we have free combinations, things that are completely compositional and least lexically fixed. So we have minus lexically fixed plus compositional. For example, a blue top, a blue shirt, right? I have something on top of me, it looks like a blue top. And it's a free combination because a shirt can be blue or pink or red or black or white, you name it, it can be of that color. It's fully compositional and it's not fixed in the sense that, many pieces of clothing can be blue and t-shirts can be of many different, of all sorts of, colors. So these are free combinations. And we have them at the far left, one end of the continuum. At the other end of the continuum, we have idioms, which are least compositional and most fixed. So things that are really fixed, really rigid, right? And at least compositional. So it's important to know that lexical fixedness and compositionality are not unrelated. They are related in a number of ways, right? But they're distinct, right? So something that is least compositional is also most fixed. But the two are somewhat different, as I mentioned on the first slide. So here we have idioms, possibly proverbs, possibly some other fixed expressions such as kith and kin, by and large, and of course, most idioms. They are at the far right end of this continuum. And in the middle, we have my favorite type of combinations of them all, collocations. Now, collocations are beautiful because there are just thousands and thousands and thousands of them in a language. And they are kind of fixed, but not fully fixed. They're kind of compositional, but can be literal as well. So they're kind of in the middle, and they can be slightly closer to idioms or slightly closer to free combinations, depending on the collocation. So they're kind of in the middle between free combinations and idioms on this continuum. Now, another approach, which is vastly different from the phraseological approach, is what we call frequency-based or statistical approach. In this approach, word combinations are identified on the basis of frequency. So, for example, how likely two or more word combinations to occur together based on the frequency of the phrase and based on the frequency of the individual components. So this approach does not take into account fixedness or compositionality with anything at all other than frequency. So this approach is interested entirely and fully in how frequent something is, frequent a phrase is, relative to the individual word frequency. So the two approaches are very different in how they define something that is formulaic. And my usual approach in my research, in fact, most of my research has employed the frequency or statistical approach. By far, this is the most commonly adopted by me approach in my research. However, in this study, together with my colleagues, we adopted the phraseological approach. And I think it's only a second study that I have conducted with my colleagues that has employed this approach, which kind of adds to my interest. It's nice to kind of venture out of your comfort zone. One thing is to work with corpora and with frequency, say raw frequency, then transform, but work with frequency, nothing else. And another thing is kind of ignoring frequency and looking at possible characteristics such as compositionality and fixedness of the items. So this is exactly what we're doing in this study. We're not looking at frequency, or we are, but not as a primary characteristic. And instead, we're focusing on lexical fixedness and essentially trying to find support for the phraseological approach. Now, before I talk about the actual study, I thought I would just say a few words about the common trends in phrasal processing research. There have been a few trends in online processing of multi-word expressions in L1 and L2. Now, one of these lines of research has focused specifically on figurative language. So things that are non-literal, such as idioms. And researchers have looked at L1 processing of idioms and L2 processing of idioms. And kind of opposing findings have been reported. So for example, while L1 speakers were found to process figurative meanings faster than literal meanings, L2 speakers seem to process figurative meanings more slowly than literal meanings. So for an L1 speaker, the default figurative meaning seems to be primary. So for example, when an L1 speaker reads something along the lines of kick the bucket, they activate the figurative meaning rather than the literal meaning, because it's also a more common meaning, right? Whereas L2 speakers seem to prefer the literal meaning, and they process the literal meaning first and faster than the figurative meaning. And researchers have suggested that this is because L2 speakers would have acquired the literal meanings of the individual words before they acquired the figurative meaning of the entire phrase. So an L2 speaker would have learned kick, that bucket, these three individual words, and the literal meanings before they acquired, much later in life, the figurative meaning of the idiom. So we have this somewhat contrasting finding for L1 and L2 speakers with regards to idioms, which are most fixed and least compositional, and they are the far end of our phraseological continuum. Another line of research that has been very popular, and in fact, while idiom research has been around from at least the 1970s, so idioms have been researched for a long time, way before collocations and other types of multi-word expressions have started to be researched. The tradition of looking at idiom processing dates back to at least the 1970s. And it's perhaps the most, because I believe idioms are perhaps the most idiosyncratic type of multi-word expressions. So they have been researched for a long time, in particular, how the figurative meaning is processed relative to the literal. So we know a lot about that. More recently, I would say since about 10, 15 years ago, research has turned to the processing of collocations, the online processing of collocations. And that's because researchers became more interested in the distribution of properties and frequency effects. So until these early studies, I would say probably Inbo Arnan, who's a researcher in Israel, she was one of the first to start to investigate phrase frequency effects. Her first study, I think, is 2010, so that's about 12 years ago. She was perhaps one of the pioneers. And that's perhaps one of the earliest studies to report on frequency effects in phrases. Until then, frequency effects were studied widely, but they were studied in the context of single word processing, not multi-word expression processing. So about just over a decade ago, researchers became hugely interested in phrase frequency effects and distributional properties, linguistic properties, at different levels of granularity, meaning that frequency effects exist at the level of morphemes, at the level of single word, at the level of a phrase, as well as at the level of a sentence. So this is what I mean by different levels of granularity. So frequency effects are ubiquitous, and they're not specific only to morpheme or word frequency, but go beyond that. And by and large, most research has found that both L1 and L2 speakers process higher frequency combinations faster than lower frequency phrases. This is a very common reported finding in L1 research, and also a rather commonly presented finding, reported finding in L2 research. Although we also know that L2 proficiency, amount of exposure to the second language, plays a role. And also the type of multi-word expression can also play a role. So while pretty much every single L1 study has reported phrase frequency effects for native speakers, for L1 speakers, not every single L2 study has reported the same, because such things as proficiency or type of multi-word expressions, etc., or even exposure or context, sorry, not exposure, context, things like English as a second language versus English as a foreign language. These factors have also been found to play a role. So the finding is somewhat less robust in the context of L2 speakers. We also know that things such as familiarity and semantic association have been found to play a role. And in fact, these characteristics, frequency, phrase frequency, familiarity, and the strength of association, they have been found to correlate strongly, but still they seem to be rather different and distinct characteristics. So there are instances that of items, there are phrases that are highly frequent and highly familiar. But there are also phrases that are highly familiar, but are highly infrequent. If you think of idioms and some phrasal expressions, for example, kith and kin is high familiarity. Most native speakers of British English will know it, kith and kin, but it is a very low frequency phrase. Many idioms are high familiarity, but low frequency. For example, everything but the kitchen sink. To take everything but the kitchen sink. So pretty much take everything with you on the trip. Extremely low frequency, but high familiarity. Strength of association. So how strongly associated, say, two words are within a combination. This feature has been found to play a different role from phrase frequency, although they correlate, because association measures are usually formulas that include phrase frequency and individual word frequency. So by default, they will correlate, but processing research points to the conclusion that familiarity, semantic association, and frequency play somewhat different roles, and that the frequency, the type of the multi-word expression is also affected differently by these features. So some multi-word expressions may be differently affected by these three features. So idioms and collocations will be affected by these three features differently. So there's an interesting study by Karen Conklin that looks at this interplay between familiarity, association, and frequency, the processing of multi-word expressions, if you are interested. Now, by and large, the vast majority of processing research into multi-word expressions has been conducted on immediately adjacent multi-word expressions. So, for example, strong tea, red cross, powerful cat, do homework, do a favor, and so on, immediately adjacent multi-word expressions. But in natural language, a lot of multi-word expressions are used and have been found to be used with some intervening elements. So, for example, we can say to lend a hand, to help someone to lend a hand, and we can modify it so as to insert an adjective, for example, to lend a helping hand. So we change the expression from adjacent, lend a hand, to non-adjacent, lend a helping hand. We modify it by inserting an an element. And recently, in particular, Wilkaite and Schmidt have looked at the processing of non-adjacent multi-word expressions. It is still a very much young line of inquiry. There have been very few studies, so we need more on this. But the little evidence that does exist seems to suggest that L1 and L2 speakers process adjacent collocations faster than their respective controls. However, when this adjacent collocation is modified and becomes a non-adjacent collocation, then this processing advantage appears to persevere in L1 speakers, but is lost in L2 speakers. So, for example, lend a hand is a collocation. Lend a helping hand is a modified collocation. L1 speakers process both types of collocations faster than their controls, whereas for L2 speakers, the processing advantage is lost once the expression is modified and is used in its modified form. But again, it's a very young line of inquiry, and we need more research, including more proficiency levels, more multi-word expression types, and different methodologies used. Okay. Some research, in particular Gilstad and Walter, that's Brent Walter, who's also affiliated with the OUC, has looked at the role of compositionality in online processing of multi-word expressions. These authors found that more compositional combinations were processed faster than less compositional combinations. So if the meaning of individual words contributes to the overall meaning of the expression, then the readers seem to benefit from this and process such expressions faster than those expressions whose individual components do not make such an obvious contribution to the meaning of the entire phrase. But again, this research is somewhat limited. Relatively few studies have looked at the role of compositionality in the online processing of multi-word expressions. And even fewer have looked at the role of lexical fixedness. In fact, to the best of our knowledge, and I might be wrong, but to the best of our knowledge, no study has investigated phrasal processing along the phraseological continuum in terms of lexical fixedness. So we kind of identified this gap, and we thought it would be useful to look at the role of fixedness in the online processing of multi-word expressions where the phraseological approach is adopted. And that's what motivated the present study. So we posed the following research questions. How do L1 and L2 speakers process word combinations which differ in lexical fixedness? And does L2 proficiency affect the processing of word combinations? Again, that differ in lexical fixedness. So our key aspects of interest, or the key aspects that we were interested in were proficiency and lexical fixedness. Okay. Now, because my colleagues are based, the other three collaborators are Italian, two based, Irene and Alessandro based in Italy, and Marco finished his studies in Italy and moved to Canada and is now researching in Canada. So it was obvious, it was natural for us to work with Italian but we also chose Italian because it is a relatively under-researched second language. I might have mentioned this in my previous talks. I like to work with less represented, underrepresented L2s. Most research in our field has been done on English, so I tried to focus on Chinese as a second language and Italian as a second language. I don't speak Chinese, but I have wonderful collaborators, and I have wonderful collaborators in Italy, and I happen to speak Italian as well, which helps. So for this study, we looked at Italian as L1 and Italian as L2. So we extracted 60 Italian verb-noun combinations. Now, for the purpose of the study, let's call them original combinations, okay? In the original form, okay? They are the form extracted from the corpus, original combinations. We had 30 collocations and 33 combinations. Now, you may remember the continuum I showed you at the beginning. So 3 combinations would be something like, I have the Italian, guardare un film, and I have the English translation, to watch a movie. And we had collocations that were kind of more restricted and less compositional. So for example, to keep a promise, mantenere una promessa. Now these combinations were extracted from one of the biggest Italian corpora called La Repubblica. I believe it's a written corpus, which is potentially a downside, but few languages can boast availability of large representative corpora similar to English. So in English, we have several corpora to choose from, for example, the Coke and the BNC. Other languages are not as lucky. So La Repubblica is a written corpus, but still it's giant and it has been used widely in research. So to remember from this slide, a couple of things to remember from this slide, 30 original collocations and 30 original free combinations, okay? We also had controls that were created by substituting the verb with a synonym. We call this variant combinations. So original and variant. Variants are those where the verb was substituted. Remember when I mentioned lexical fixedness, I said that essentially, can we easily substitute one of the words in a phrase with a synonym, okay? So these combinations, original collocations, original free combinations, were modified by changing the verb, and they became variant collocations and variant free combinations. Let me give you a couple of examples. So mantenere una promessa, keep a promise, original collocation, became conservare una promessa or retain a promise. Same meaning, but a different verb, okay? And same was done, the same procedure was done with original free combinations. For example, guardare un film became vedere un film, so to watch, to see a movie. These combinations were embedded in sentence context, and we also had a bunch of fillers. So again, the important thing to remember, we had original collocation, original free combination, and then variant collocations and variant free combinations. We had a bunch of L1 speakers of Italian that were fairly easy to find. And we had a smaller number of L2 speakers of different proficiency. I believe we had a bit of a trouble identifying or finding L2 learners of Italian. It's not a terribly common second language. So ideally, we would have had more people, or at least a similar number of L1 and L2. So that's perhaps one of the things for us to consider and maybe slightly worry about, because reviewers might have an issue with a somewhat lower number of L2 speakers. Anyway, our L2 speakers were asked to rate their language skills on a 5-point Likert scale. Again, in English, we're somewhat lucky because there are different placement tests. There's TOEFL, there's IELTS, that generic tests, and they are exactly the same, whichever country you are being tested in. Italian doesn't really have such an IELTS or TOEFL equivalent. So we didn't have any official test results we could use for our learners, which is why they rated their skills on the 5-point Likert scale, was self-reported. We treated proficiency as the mean of the 4 skills. So they rated their speaking, their writing, their listening, and their reading. And we used the mean of the 4 skills in our data analysis. This is an eye tracking experiment. So we designed our experiment in the experiment Boda, which I believe the OUC has, and we recorded eye movements using the iLink portable dual eye tracker. And I believe the OUC also has the iLink, probably not portable, but one of the iLink eye trackers. Now, the task of the participants was to read sentences for comprehension. So they were reading target phrases embedded in sentences, and there were comprehension questions, I believe, after each trial, and participants were required to press yes or no to respond to each question. This is commonly done to make sure that participants stay focused, awake, they don't just keep press a button, but they actually do the task well. Now, one of the beauties of eye movements, and I believe I'm giving a talk on eye movements in vocabulary research in a couple of weeks. So I'll talk more about that, but I thought I'd mention this in this talk anyway. Now, one of the beauties of the eye movement methodology is that we can look at multiple eye tracking measures, which gives us an extremely rich picture of the different processes or different mechanisms. And not only that, we can also tease apart early and late stages of processing. So not only eye movements allow us to collect data in the most naturalistic way you can possibly do in a laboratory environment, you can present entire stories or entire sentences, which is very much unlike reaction time experiments where you present sentences one word at a time. So it's very natural, allows for natural way of stimuli presentation, but you can also analyze multiple areas, multiple eye tracking measures, looking specifically at early and later processes or stages of reading. So in this study, we employed 4 eye tracking measures. First pass reading time, it's an early measure. Total reading time, which is a late measure. Fixation count, which is a late measure, but it is not a processing measure. It is a count of fixations. It is not a processing measure per se. And the regression pass duration, which is also a late measure. In a second, the next slide, I will show you what these measures are a little in some detail. I will just say that the reason I have this in bold is because for all the data analysis and the results I will cover in a minute, they will be for just this one measure. This is because we haven't fully finished data analysis, and also because I do not want to overwhelm you and we don't have that much time. So I will only cover one measure, total reading time. So here's an example of, this is a hypothetical eye movement record. Here's a sentence. She was driven from her home by her husband at noon. And the The shaded areas are area of interest. So the first two fixations within the area of interest, the first fixation, the very first fixation is our first fixation duration. That's number 3. The first two fixations before eyes moved to the left out of the area of interest, these are our 3 and 4. We call this measure first pass reading time. Every single fixation within the area of interest, that's 3, 4, and 6, that's total reading time. Sometimes we have to go back to the earlier text and then we re-enter our area of interest. These are 3, 4, 5, and 6 fixations, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this is our regression pass duration. And there are other less commonly used measures that I have here on the screen, but I will not cover them. So in this study, we looked at first pass reading time, that's 3 and 4 on the figure, total reading time, 3, 4, and 6 on the figure, regression pass duration, 3, 4, 5, and 6, okay, and fixation count, which is not a measure of processing or reading in milliseconds, but rather simply fixation count. In this case, there are 3 fixations, okay. Now, another beauty of this method is that we can look at multiple interest areas, okay? So in this study, we looked at the whole word combination, at only the verb and only the noun. So 3 areas of interest. Again, I will not cover every single, in the analysis and results, I will not cover every single area just because I don't want to overwhelm you. But these are the areas of interest that we analyzed. So now let's have a look at the analysis and some of the results. Now we use mixed effects modeling with the following predictors. Essentially, we looked at frequency, phrase type. Remember that phrase type is free combination versus collocation. Condition is original versus variant. These are our key things, right? Phrase type, free versus collocation, and condition, original versus variant. And a few interactions, as well as proficiency. Now, for proficiency, you may remember I mentioned that we used for L2 speakers the mean of the 4 skills, but we also included L1 speakers. They received the maximum score because, of course, they would be at the ceiling, okay? And we wanted to include them in the analysis, so they needed to have some numerical values. So L1 speakers were given the maximum possible score for the purpose of the analysis. Now there were, we had quite a number of models. So there were 4 models, 1 for each eye tracking measure. There were 4 models for 3 interest areas. Okay, so we had 4 eye tracking measures and 3 interest areas. So for each interest area, so whole combination verb and noun, there were 4 models for each of the eye tracking measures. Okay, the important thing for me to show you are the figures, but before I show you the figures, I thought I'd mention that some of the key significant predictors that we found were phrase type, so whether it's free combination or it's a collocation, condition, whether it's original variant, and the interactions between proficiency and condition, and phrase type and condition. So let's have a look at a couple of figures. So here we are looking at the main effect of condition. Again, as I mentioned, all the data I'm showing is for total reading time, 1 late measure. So this is the whole combination, the interest area representing the whole combination. So this is a simple effect of condition. We see that original, non-modified original items were processed faster than variant combinations, okay? And this is kind of what we expected. Original items were processed faster than variant modified items. Here we're looking at the interaction between proficiency and condition. So proficiency is along our x-axis. 5 is the maximum score possible. Here we have all native speakers, and non-native speakers are pretty much along the entire continuum, from least proficient to most proficient. And here we have the left panel is the original combination, as the right panel is our variant combination. So what we see here is, let's have a look at L1 speakers first. They are always here at the very far right end, here and here. So L1 speakers read original combinations faster than they read variant combinations. Okay, you see? Faster than they read variant combinations. What about our L2 speakers? Let's have a look at, they're pretty much along the entire continuum here and here. But we kind of see that they are processing original combinations in a way similar to variant combinations. And if anything, they're processing variant combinations slightly faster than original combinations, which is the opposite of what you would expect. So they don't seem, L2 speakers don't seem to show faster reading for original items compared to variant items in a way similar to L1 speakers. So it's a proficiency condition interaction. Now let's have a look at the interaction between phrase type and condition. Okay, so phrase type is our collocation versus free combination, and our condition is our original versus variant. So collocation free combination, again, collocation free combination. Left panel original, right panel variant. And what do we find? Let's have a look first at collocation original versus collocation variant. And you immediately see that collocation, the original collocation was read much faster than variant collocation. And original free combination was read in a way kind of similar to variant free combination. Okay, so this is an interaction between phrase type and condition. And finally, let's have a look at, oops, I should have mentioned that the first two figures were whole combination interest area. This was noun interest area, but the pattern of results is very similar. The pattern of results for the entire phrase versus just the noun was very similar. And this is our proficiency condition interaction for the noun, which is the last word, keep promise, the very last word in the combination. What do we see here? So this is proficiency. Again, L2 speakers are everywhere and L1 speakers were given the maximum score. So we see that original combinations were read faster by L1 speakers who are here compared to variant combinations. So here are variant combinations read by L1 speakers. And these are original combinations read by L1 speakers. And our L2 speakers, who are pretty much along the entire x-axis, are reading variant combinations faster than original combinations. So they're kind of doing the opposite, or at least the least proficient, doing the opposite of L1 speakers. So there's clear an interaction between proficiency and condition when the interest area is a noun and when the interest area is a whole combination. So the interactions are very similar for the two interest areas. This is whole combination and this is noun. So as I mentioned earlier, you can look at multiple areas of interest, and our whole combination area of interest and our noun area of interest shows similar results. So, so for L1 speakers, we find that noun of the original and variant free combinations were read in a similar way. And noun of the original collocation was read faster than the noun of the variant collocation. For L2 speakers, the findings were in a way similar, but also in a way different. So noun of the original and variant free combinations were read in a similar way at all levels of proficiency. However, lower proficiency learners read noun in variant collocations faster than noun in original collocations. And high proficiency learners read noun in the original collocations faster than nouns in the variant collocations. So proficiency clearly played a role. And the more proficient our learners were, the more akin to L1 speakers they were. So let me put this in more generic terms. We found that original collocations were processed faster than variant collocations. And that's exactly what you would expect or what would be predicted by the phraseological approach. If collocation is a kind of semi-fixed, then if you modify it, this results in a processing cost. So original collocations should thus be processed faster than variant collocations. We found this processing advantage only in later stages of processing. I did not report the findings for earlier measures, but this advantage was found only for later stages of processing, which is kind of in line with earlier research, which suggests that collocation is most predictable at the end. So on the last word of a collocation is most predictable because it's the very last word of a phrase, and it's the preceding context that makes it more predictable. So these findings suggest that modification of a collocation leads to processing cost. Lexical fixedness affected the processing of collocations, but not free combinations. And this is exactly what would be predicted by the phraseological models. So original and variant free, this is in addition to this. So this is about collocations. On top of that, we found that original and variant free combinations were read in a similar way. There was no processing cost to modifying free combination. Again and again, that's exactly what would be predicted by the phraseological model. You modify free combination, nothing changes. You modify collocation, it leads to a processing cost. So unlike collocations, free combinations are not lexically fixed. And their modification does not lead to slowing down. And so we found an interesting effect of O2 proficiency. So more proficient learners were processing things more similar to L1 speakers. And the less proficient learners were doing the opposite. So this kind of underlines the role of exposure. So to sum up, we found that lexical fixedness affects the processing of collocations, but not free combinations. Participants showed a processing cost when reading variant collocations, but not when reading variant free combinations. So clearly, lexical fixedness makes a difference and affects only processing of combinations. And what the future research could focus on could be, for example, looking at the processing of the entire phraseological continuum. So free combinations, collocations, and idioms, employing eye movements because they offer a lot of rich data, and possibly things such as event-related brain potentials. Future research could look at other phrase types. We looked at verb-noun, but other phrase types could also be looked at, and other L2s could also be included in future research. This is all I had for today. Thank you very much for listening.
Hey, thank you very much, Anna. We appreciate your wonderful talk, and I think we some new dimensions of research in your talk. The fixed lexical fixedness issue, I think, and a well-designed research, and your research can be replicated in the background of Chinese, I think, yeah.
Yep, that's exactly what I was thinking when I was kind of adding points for future research. I thought, don't think it has been done with Chinese, so that could be a potential fruitful avenue for future research.
So thank you so much. Any questions? Any questions for you from our teachers and students?
There's a question in the chat from Linda. Could you please explain the differences between collocations and free combinations? That's an excellent question. It's a fairly straightforward process if you're adopting the frequency-based approach, because you would say higher frequency combinations with, for example, higher strength of association would be collocation. So for example, T-score and mutual information are used to determine collocations versus non-collocations. If, for example, a combination has mutual information, which is a measure of association strength of 3 or more, it is considered to be a significant collocation. If it has the score of mutual information less than 3, it's considered to be a non-collocation. So it's a straightforward process with, if you adopt the frequency-based approach. But if you adopt the phraseological approach, then I believe you would rely on L1 intuition to determine whether it's a free combination or it is a collocation. So it's a more subjective approach. You would essentially explain the task to a panel of L1 speakers, and this panel of L1 speakers would determine whether it's a free combination or a collocation. So it's a slightly more more subjective and more error-prone approach in the phraseological model, and more objective and less error-prone in the frequency-based approach, because you rely on corpus frequency and you rely on association measures that again rely on corpus frequency. But the idea is to identify phrases that are fully free and phrases that are restricted in one way, in some small way. So for example, in a collocation, you can substitute one term, one word, but not both, right? In idioms, you cannot substitute anything. And in free combinations, you can substitute pretty much anything because these phrases are not restricted in any way or form. So for example, blue balloon would be a free combination because many things can be blue and balloons can be of many different colors. Something like, can you do me a favor, do a favor, is more restricted, but not as restricted as idioms. So if you look at this continuum, we have something super restricted at one end, something not restricted at all at the other end, and collocations kind of in the middle. Has it answered the question a little bit?
Hi, Anna. Thank you for your answer. You can follow me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, this is a chance. We write to each other. I have questions. From your previous lecture, you mentioned the multi-word expression many times, I think. All right. So I think you give us a continuum about the multi-word expression from a free combination to collocation to idioms. This is a continuum, all right? So I think, in your study, you tell us, you give us your material, you give us 30 collocations and 30 free combinations, all right? So I just want to know, how do you measure, how do you define 30 collocations and 30 free combinations?
I think it's a question related to the previous question about how you distinguish.
Yeah.
I believe we used a panel of L1 speakers, but I would need to double check with the first author, Irene Fioravanti. So I will be very happy to if somebody emailed me, and I will check with the first author and I will respond. So I believe we used L1 speakers to distinguish between free combinations and collocations, because this is how you would do it in the phraseological approach. In the frequency-based approach, you would not do this. You would not rely on L1 intuition. You would rely on numbers, on corpora. But in the phraseological approach, you usually rely on the subjective L1 intuitions. But I need to check this with the first author because I can't remember now. So if I get an email with this question, I'll be very happy to answer this this question. So please do email me, and I will be very happy to follow up with the first author and respond to this email, to respond to this question, so that I did not give you any wrong information.
So since your material comes from L1 speakers, so this the collocation of free combination, can they be used to measure L2 speakers?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly, yeah. We're using L1 combinations to probe L2 learners.
And also found there are 22 L2 speakers of Italy in your studies, all right? And they are at a different proficiency also.
That's right. So yeah, so relatively low number and different proficiency. And I guess it's because we couldn't find any more, which is not a good excuse. Yes, the number is low, and there's a great variation because they have different proficiency. So this is definitely one of the limitations. And I guess one thing we will be talking about is, can we collect more data? Can we find more L2 speakers?
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Okay, I think there are several good questions, but we don't have enough time. At this moment, I think could we invite the several PhD students here to see each other with Anna? I think we have 3 PhD students. The third year students, Lini, I think is currently visiting at Professor Brent Walter in the United States for a year, I think.
And Lini now is taking a lesson from Brent Walter.
Yeah, I think, Okay. She's visiting in the United States, and I think you exchanged a lot of information, I think, yeah. And the other 2, I think the second year and the first year and second year students, Yu Mengchu and Yang Xing. Yeah. Well, would you join us to see each other?
maybe they have some questions.
This is a new way. This is a new way to meet. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, you mean now or
Very good way.
at a different time?
Yeah.
就是杨欣、孟初 ，Yeah.
Mengzhu, yeah.
Hello, Mengzhu. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for the lecture today. I learned a lot. Now I'm in the second grade for my PhD study, and I'm really interested in Chinese EFL learners' collocation process and the influencing factors. I'm preparing for my thesis proposal and hope for your guidance. Actually, I have two questions, but the time is limited, so maybe I can send them from email.
Yeah, and in fact, I consider a few questions, and I would absolutely not want anyone to have that question not answered. So, and I know we're already past 2:30. So please do email me. I will reply. If I know the answer, I reply anyway, but hopefully I'll reply in a helpful way. And I would not want anyone to go away from this class with their question not answered. So please do email me if we don't have time now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And this applies to all the other questions in the chat. Please do email me.
Okay.
I think in the coming year, Mengzhu will have the purpose of research in this field.
Yeah.
Submit the proposal of research. Yeah. Another student, another piece.
Yeah, Yanxi just reconnected the room now. Yeah. Hey, Yanxi.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Yangqi.
杨欣，请看你的开麦，没开麦，杨欣。
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna. My name is Yang Xin. Sorry.
Hello.
I'm a first-year PhD student, and my research area and my research direction is psychological linguistics. And my interest my research interest is focused on the processing of ambiguous word.
Beautiful. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And I think Lini is also here. We've exchanged a few emails recently. I know she's probably having great time with the States with Brent.
I think Lini said that Brent Water is having the classes now. Yeah. She's on his class now. Yeah. Lini, I think, has she finished the class now? No, she hasn't joined the Zoom now.
No, I can see her.
She's taking another class. Okay.
Anna, I think that the PhD students here we have now are as smart as you have in New Zealand. So
I believe.
So we hope we have more chances to exchange.
Same here. Yep.
Okay.
Same here. I very much hope in our continued and fruitful collaboration.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's almost time. We have other issues to do after your.
I am sure you do. And I'll just repeat again. Please do email me. I do want to answer all your questions and help you if you need me to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We could supervise these PhD students, I think. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We look forward to meet you at Qingdao.
Same here. Same here.
Thank you. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye. Bye-bye.
那咱们是觉得因为那个陈老师是不是咱们这个课陈霞同学你们不是在 Zoom 是吧？是在那个
对，咱还在那个腾讯那边还是？
是接着
腾讯那个是咱学校报的学校里边那个地方。
啊，现在就是咱用腾讯还是用这个继续？
咱们要不用腾讯吧？
用腾讯哈，就大家在
因为腾讯这个可以，就可以这个比较方便的，可能对。哎，好，
那也可以。
要不咱休息啊，让大家几分钟。
休息10分钟吧，休息10分钟。
那9:50吧，好吧？
好嘞，好嘞，
好，各位9:50咱腾讯会议见。好，
好嘞，
好。